There was a time when our values were similar, regardless of which side of the political aisle you sat on. You just had different ideals of how to get there. Now, the values aren't the same. They don't want the same things, and it makes life very difficult, which means courage. Courage is the only way. When I was running for president, I traveled all over the country to the largest cities, the smallest hamlets. And one of the things that was really encouraging to me is that most of the people in our country have common sense. What they don't have is courage. You know, they'll sit there in the corner and stare at their shoes rather than speak up when something controversial comes up. But think about this. What did God say in 2 Timothy 1:7? Not giving you a spirit of fear, not fear, power and love and a sound mind. And the only way that we really keep things free and open is we have to be courageous. You can't be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave. And it is the people of faith who are called upon to make that clear to the population. You know, the American dream has a lot to do with freedom. And freedom has a lot to do with courage. And courage has a lot to do with leadership. You know, my American dream had to do with the ministry. I've always been an admirer of people in the ministry, but I also had a great love of medicine. So I loved anything that had to do with missionary doctors. They seemed like the most noble people on the face of the earth, traveling all over the world, many times at great self-sacrifice and danger, to bring not only spiritual healing, but physical healing and mental healing. They seem like the most noble people on the face of the earth. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I was going to be a missionary doctor. And that was my dream until I was 13, at which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV, they seemed like rich people. You know, they lived in the big fancy mansions and drove Jaguars and had these big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is gonna work out really well. And, you know, I started reading Psychology Today in high school. I was a local shrink. Everybody brought me their problems. I would sit them down and stroke my chin, say, tell me about your mama. And I majored in psychology at Yale and had some interesting professors. One of my professors was Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud. And we were into all this psychoanalysis, and I was gung-ho. When I went to medical school, I really didn't even consider anything other than psychiatry. But then I started listening to the neurosurgeons and the incredible things that they could do with the brain and the spinal cord. And I was just fascinated. And I started moving in that direction. And people said, no, 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 no. You don't want to do neurosurgery. At that time, there had only been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. But I'll tell you a secret. Our Lord and Father does not distribute talent based on race. And I took to neurosurgery like a duck takes to water. It was just so natural for me. And I started out as an adult neurosurgeon. But I quickly discovered that no matter how good an operation you did on those chronic back pain patients, they never got any better until they got their settlement. Whereas, whereas with children, what you see is what you get. You know, if they feel good, you know they feel good. They feel bad, you know they feel bad. And you can operate on a kid for 10, 15, 20, 30 hours. And if you're successful, the reward may be 50, 60, 70, 80 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time operating and they die in 5 years or something else. So I like to get a big return on my investment. Just kidding, I like old people. You know, I'm one of them now. But you know, the problem is I was not a very good student. And in retrospect, I really was afraid to apply myself to my studies because I was afraid that I wouldn't succeed. So rather than be in that situation, you let that fear push you into a corner. And fear affected other parts of my life too in a big way. I was deathly afraid of dogs. And every time I came out of the house, I was looking, is there a dog? I'd be going to school. I would almost get there, and there would be a dog. And I would have to go all the way around the block and come up from another direction, and there'd be another dog. And I'd be late for school. And it was really affecting my life. And then a man told me something. He said, Benny, if you act like you're not afraid of the dog, they won't bother you. He says, no matter how big and vicious they are, they will not bother you if they don't think you're afraid of them. I said, are you sure about that? He said, guaranteed. So I said, I'm going to try this out. There was this dog down the street named Rusty, and nobody liked to go down there because Rusty was so mean. And I said, I'm going to go down to Rusty's area. And I go strolling confidently down there. I'm not afraid of Rusty. And he saw me, and he started licking his chops. And he came running after me, snarling and barking, and I said, this was a mistake. And he came up to my leg and sniffed it and just went away. And you know what? From that point on, Rusty never bothered me. He didn't bother to get up when I walked by. He still growled and snarled at other people. But it's just an example of how fear can change your life and can control your life and why you have to get control of it. You know, when I was a neurosurgery resident, I was on call one night, and a young man was brought into the emergency room who had been severely beaten with a baseball bat. His brain was swelling, and he was going to die. It was at a time of a national neurosurgery conference, so all the attending neurosurgeons were at the conference, except for one who had been left behind to take care of emergencies. So I called him because I couldn't take patients to the operating room myself. I was a resident. That would be illegal. But I called him, couldn't reach him. Paging operators couldn't reach him, the nurses couldn't reach him, and the young man was dying. The only thing that would save him would be a dramatic operation in which you took out part of the frontal lobe and part of the temporal lobe to create space in the brain for the rest of the swelling to occur. And there wasn't much time to do that. I was faced with a terrible dilemma. Could I take him to the operating room and do this operation, which I had seen before, I'd never done it, and it was illegal, and it would jeopardize my career? Or should I just put him in the ICU, intubated on a respirator with steroids, and hope for the best, which would have been horrible? And I prayed, and at the end of that prayer, a peace came over me. No anxiety whatsoever. I knew what I had to do. I had to take him to the operating room, and I had to do this operation. And everything came back to me crystal clear. And the operation was successful. And I didn't get into any trouble whatsoever. In fact, I was praised for having done the right thing. And that young man today is a child psychologist helping other people. But again, you can see how that fear can be overcome through Christ. No matter what it is, he has already conquered it. And there's so many examples throughout your life. You know, when I was chief resident, we had the grand opening of the Neuroscience Center at Johns Hopkins. And since Hopkins is sort of the modern birthplace of neurosurgery, all the big wigs from around the world were there, including one of the big wigs from Australia. And he took a liking to me, and he said, "You ought to come to Australia and be the senior registrar at our major teaching hospital in Western Australia." And I said, "Australia? Are you kidding me? I mean, where's Australia? You drill a hole from Baltimore, you come out in Australia." Plus, I heard all these stories about Australia having a whites-only policy, so I just kind of poo-pooed the whole idea. I wasn't going to do that. And it seemed like every time I turned around, there was somebody saying, "Good eye, mate. How you going?" And I just kept running into Australians everywhere. They seemed like nice people. And every time we turned the TV on, there was a special on about Australia. And I said to Candy, "I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia." And she went and did some research and discovered they did have a whites-only policy, but it was an unofficial policy, and it had officially been abolished in 1968. And that was 1983. So we sold all of our ocean goods, and off we went to Australia. And our friends said, "You'll be back in 3 weeks." But little did they know we didn't have any more money. But you know, the biggest problem we had was keeping up with all the dinner invitations. They love Americans. They'll invite you over just to hear your accent. And I would say, "Excuse me, I'm the American, you have the accent." But every time I sat down and started writing in a chart, and invariably someone would come up and say, "Do you mind if I feel your hair?" And I would say, "You can feel it, but it's going to cost you $10. But I would tell the Aussies I couldn't remember any of their names because they all looked alike. But the real thing here is, if I had listened to that spirit of fear, I was never gone. And there were only 4 neurosurgical consultants in all of Western Australia. And once they discovered that I could operate, they kind of left me in charge of the major teaching hospital. And they went out to the private hospitals. And I was doing 3 or 4 major craniotomies every day, getting an enormous amount of experience. If I had stayed on at Johns Hopkins, I would have been the low man on the totem pole, got to do what nobody else wanted to do. So when I went back to Hopkins a year later, and the position opened up for chief of pediatric neurosurgery, normally they'd go out and get somebody with a lot of gray hair and a big name. They said, "Carson's only 33, but he can do everything." And that's how I became chief of pediatric neurosurgery at a major teaching hospital at such a young age. But what does that tell you about God and how he prepares you for what he wants you to do, and how you have to move forward and not allow the fear to hamper what you're doing? Courage. You know, as an attending, they say everybody gets 15 minutes of fame. Well, one of the neurologists came to me, said, there's this girl in Colorado, and she's having 130 seizures a day, and no one can control it. We've tried everything, even putting her into a pentobarbital coma for 2 weeks. And as soon as they lifted the coma, the seizures started right back up again. And he said, do you think you could do a hemispherectomy, an operation in which you take out half the brain in selected patients to control their seizures? And this was not an operation that was invented by me. It was first done by Walter Dandy in the early 30s at Johns Hopkins. And a number of people tried it, but it had fallen out of favor because the morbidity and the mortality rates were too high. And I said, let me think about this, because you don't want to be a hot dog and do something that nobody else is doing and fail, because that would be a terrible blow. So I said, let me study all the literature. Let me see why these things have not worked. And I discovered some things that are going on in the past in surgery suites that don't happen anymore, and some of the kind of complications that we now know how to control decades later. And I said, if we apply the new knowledge that has been obtained over these last few decades, maybe this will work. And it did, and it was fabulously successful. And this little girl was so cute. She was from Denver. She would always say, I'm from Denverado. And, you know, she and her mom were very photogenic. And they got a lot of attention, and other people started coming for hemispherectomies. And although it was a novel thing at that point, today hemispherectomies are done in all children's hospitals. And improvements have been made on the techniques, and it's standard procedure. Wouldn't have happened if I hadn't combined courage with knowledge. Study yourself to be approved, a workman that needeth not be ashamed. That helps a lot when you have to go into one of those situations. Now, a lot of people say, well, it must have really taken a lot of courage to go into politics. And they say, why would you go from a successful medical career into the sleazy world of politics? And I frequently ask myself that too. But you know, in 2013, I was asked to give the presidential prayer breakfast keynote address. And I was kind of astonished because I had given it in 1997 when Bill Clinton was president. And I had talked about integrity in office. And it was just before the Lewinsky thing broke. He must be saying, does he know something? You know? But in 2013, I wasn't aware that anybody ever did it twice. And then I did some research and found out there was one person who did it twice, and that was Billy Graham. And I said, wow, that's pretty good company. So I agreed to do it. But after that speech, everybody was saying, you should run for president. And I was saying, these people are crazy. And I said, if I just ignore them, it'll go away. But it didn't. Every place I went, they had placards, run, Ben, run. I had more than 500,000 petitions in my office. I could barely get in there. I finally said, Lord, if you really want me to do this, you have to give me all the things that a person who runs for president has, a Rolodex with all the important names, an organization, a lot of money. And I said, I'm not going to go out and try to develop those things. So you have to provide them. The next thing I knew, they were all there. And our organization was raising more money per month than the RNC. It was incredible. But, you know, the Lord situated me in a place where we could get a lot of things done in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And he knows exactly what he's doing. You know, we are in a battle in our country. And the people on the forefront of that battle are people of faith, because our country is too strong to be taken down militarily. Our enemies know that. The people who want to fundamentally change us know that. They know that in order to take this country down, you have to attack its foundation, and that is its faith and its families. And those are the things that are under attack, and it is the people of faith who are the forefront of helping to establish and fortify the families in our country. People are not getting married anymore. Have you noticed that? Or getting married very late. We've gone from 3.6 births per woman in 1960 to 1.6 today. We're moving in the wrong direction. Our morals are being destroyed. If you really want to know what we're up against, read the congressional record, January the 10th, 1963. Congressman Herlong of Florida read in the 45 goals of communism in America, like controlling the public school system and the teacher unions so that you can indoctrinate the kids, controlling Hollywood and the news media so that you could change the culture, denigrating the role of the church, and casting doubt upon the veracity of the Bible, making sure there was no public Bible reading or public prayer. Here's one that's really hits close to home, making sexual perversion normal, natural, and healthy. All of those things are happening. And if we don't stand in the brink, those of us in the faith community and the faith leaders don't stand in the brink, what do you think is going to happen? I don't think that we have a chance. And in 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study ostensibly our penal system. But then he started looking at everything. He looked at our government. It was because the Europeans, they were fascinated. They couldn't understand how a fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, was already competing with them on virtually every level. What was the explanation? De Tocqueville figured he could find out. And he was duly impressed when he looked at our governmental system and our system of checks and balances. And then he said, let me look at their business environment. And he was very impressed by how we created an atmosphere that encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation. You know, the vast majority of new inventions, 19th and 20th century, came from this country because we created the appropriate atmosphere. And then he looked at our educational system and he was blown away. He could go out into the middle of the forest and he could find a mountain man, and the guy could read. And the guy could tell you about the Declaration of Independence, our founding document. And if you really want to be impressed, take a look at a sixth grade exit exam from 150 to 200 years ago. What you had to know to get a sixth grade certificate, what you were expected to know. You'd be blown away. We have dumbed things down so significantly. Now, when you look at the international comparison studies, we rank right near the bottom, particularly in STEM areas. And it is absolutely time for us to get very busy in this area. You think about things that are happening to our children. Think about the poor children. Children are very curious and they're very suggestible. And yet we have people telling 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old kids, you may not be a girl, or you may not be a boy, and trying to confuse them. Don't you know that that's the reason that God gave children parents? Because their brains are not fully developed at that age. And they need somebody to protect them. And to be presenting this type of garbage to them, particularly without the consent of their parents, is nothing short of child abuse. And those of us in the faith community have to be willing to stand up. Because one of the things I've seen creeping into our churches is wokeism. And people putting their finger up and saying which way the wind is blowing and trying to modify God's word to conform with that. God does not change, and we should not change either. We should be able and willing to proclaim the word of God regardless of the consequences. And it may bring persecution, but no matter how much you're persecuted, what is that against the background of eternity? And that's the way I always look at it. And don't worry about persecution. But then de Tocqueville looked at our churches, and he was incredibly impressed with the fiery sermons that emanated from those pulpits that gave the militia, our militia, our amateur militia, the inspiration and the courage to defeat the most powerful military force on the face of the earth. Think how incredible that was. And to give the people a moral foundation. And when he concluded his 2-volume set, Democracy in America, de Tocqueville said, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be great, she will cease to be good. That's what we have to be concerned about. How do we make America good? We all have spheres of influence. We need to be thinking about that and not worry so much about what anybody else has to say. I've had a lot of arguments with Nobel Prize winning physicists about how our Earth got here. And some of them just say, you're a religious bigot, and they walk away because they can't answer the questions. They cannot answer the question, how did we get here? And how did all this complexity and beauty develop? And what would be required? I mean, according to their theories, you would have to have a flip coin come down heads 1,000,000 times straight. What is the likelihood of that? And they say, well, it may not be likely, but if you do it enough time over a long enough period of time, it'll happen. You just have to be billions and billions and billions of years. Well, I say, so you're telling me if I blow a hurricane through a junkyard, billions and billions of times over a long enough period of time, after one of those, there'll be a 747 all set and ready to fly. I mean, that's essentially what they're saying. And they get frustrated. But we must be willing to stand up for our God. And, you know, when I became the the director, the secretary of HUD, one of the high government officials came to me and said, "We are so thrilled that you are here and what you represent, but you're going to have to stop all this God stuff." I told him to go jump in the lake. Never going to stop the God stuff. And people who say things like that, do they realize that our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, says that our rights come from our Creator, AKA God? Do they realize that the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag says we are one nation under God? That many courtrooms on the wall, it says, "In God we trust." Every coin in our pocket, every bill in our wallet says, "In God we trust." So if it's in our founding documents, it's in our pledge, it's on our courts, and it's on our money, but we're not supposed to talk about it, what in the world is that? In medicine, we call it schizophrenia. And doesn't that explain a lot of what's going on in our country today? And we have to make it clear that it's okay to live by godly principles of loving your neighbor, of caring for those who can't care for themselves, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, of having values and principles that govern your life. And if we do that, we will not only have a great country, but we will have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Thanks for what you do.